What's up, people? So, I've been sitting on this topic about the game key cards for a couple of days, and it's largely because I didn't really know what I specifically wanted to talk about for this discussion. On one hand, I've already made a whole bunch of videos about game key cards in the first place, plus you have a whole lot of people all over YouTube talking about it right now, so I don't want to just throw my video out there just to get it mixed up with everything else. I'm usually more in favor of keeping my mouth shut unless there's something valuable I can add to the discourse. On the other hand, I'm actually very happy that Nintendo is actually trying to amend this problem. And yes, I am referring to it as a problem. I don't think that it's a coincidence that the game key cards are one of the most controversial takeaways from the entirety of the Switch 2 reveal. And I think overall, in an ideal world, that would have been the only controversial thing to occur after the Switch 2 was revealed and going into its launch. Because what happened was you had a lot of industry-wide issues that were pretty common when it comes to Nintendo already. Console bans and bricks, issues with ownership, overpriced titles. These are things that are not necessarily new to the Nintendo world. It's just become amplified for a plethora of reasons, largely because of Nintendo's lack of communication with their fanbase. And since there's been such a tug of war between people online about all of these different topics, I think the game key cards got sucked into it, and by default, people that were actually very happy and very excited for the Nintendo Switch 2 felt the need to automatically defend the cartridge, or I should say the key cartridge. Now, I think there's a very realistic reality here where people that don't actually mind the game key cards are either people that are strictly digital buyers, so they don't really care about what the physical media looks like and what is contained in the actual cartridge itself, or you have the types of people that will buy a game, play the game, beat the game, and then resell the game, so the keycard actually fulfills its purpose as a digital product. But I think it's evident from the discourse online, and most importantly from the actual sales numbers themselves and the concerns shown by shareholders of Nintendo, that a majority of people genuinely do have an issue with these game key cards. And I think there are various scenarios which apply to some people more than others, and that's part of the reason why this has become such a discrepancy online. So I'll give you a real life example right now, and I would wager that this example is going to apply to a whole lot of families out there as well. I have a sister who's about a decade older than me. She doesn't really do video games. The last time she picked up anything was on the NES when she was about 4 years old playing Super Mario Bros. She has young grade school kids. I think a couple of years ago, we actually introduced them to video games, and I'm the one who actually got them to Switch because I was like, make sure we get them in on Nintendo before they buy something else. Trying to keep the Nintendo love in the family, you know? So the other day was my nephew's birthday. He's turning 10 years old, and he recently got into Pokemon. Then I guess between talking to his friends, he realized that he really wanted Pokemon Diamond for his Switch. So I took him to the used game store and we bought Pokemon Diamond. I got actually a pretty good price on it. I was pretty happy with that. And then on our way home, he was telling me how excited he was to play Pokemon Diamond because Mario Kart doesn't work anymore. So I'm like, why doesn't Mario Kart work? That doesn't make any sense. Turns out it was two issues. See, my sister has a very old school mentality when it comes to video games. She believes they should not be connected to online at all. So it turns out what happened was that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe actually needed an update on the Switch, and my nephew doesn't understand exactly what the issue is. He just knows that game won't turn on. And in my sister's mind, she's like, absolutely not. We're not connecting this thing online because I guess she's afraid of the internet or something. Now, I was not aware of this. Obviously, once I found out that's what the issue was, I went to take care of the problem for them. I connected to the internet, updated the console, and then just deleted the internet information. But I don't visit them that often, and I don't get feedback from everybody as soon as their game console's not working, so I didn't even realize that this non-issue became such an issue for them. And the problem is, the only reason why Mario Kart 8 Deluxe actually needed an update is because one of my nephew's cousins ended up buying him FIFA. So when they ended up buying FIFA, that cousin, connected to the internet, helped him download the game, because most of the game had to be downloaded separately even though they bought the physical copy since not the entire game was on the cartridge. But then because the file size for FIFA was so large, it actually took up all of the space that was available in the Switch, so we couldn't even update Mario Kart 8 Deluxe at that point unless we bought an SD card. So now you have a console that just had a bunch of games that you would pop the cartridge in, pop the cartridge out, and you are good to go. That is effectively making a very simple gaming session a lot more complicated than it needs to be. Due to all of these limitations and speed bumps, you have to connect to the internet, you gotta buy an SD card, you gotta do all of these things that my sister had no intention of doing for her children's gaming console. Now, I completely realize that this is a scenario that probably does not apply to a single person who's listening to this right now. And honestly, even when I heard the whole situation, all I could do was laugh at my sister and call her a boomer. But with over 150 million Switches available, I would imagine there's a non-insignificant portion of people that have similar problems that I just described that my sister experienced. And yes, these are problems. And Nintendo is aware of these things. And the biggest proof I have that Nintendo is aware of these things is they ensure that every single one of the games that they publish and they send out to their customer base includes the entirety of the game on that cartridge, as well as whatever software update is required of the console in order to play that game. That's not done by accident. That's done because they know the type of people that are buying these consoles. Now, obviously, when it comes to DLC and now upgrade packs, there are some exceptions. But Nintendo, more than us, knows their crowd, and there's a reason why they do things the way that they do it. Now, I don't have a Nintendo Switch 2, but I do have 2 Nintendo Switches. One of them is my bad boy Switch that I homebrewed. I use that for my emulators, my overclocking of different games, my mods and cheats and all that fun stuff. And then I have recently got a Switch OLED, but even before the OLED, I had just a regular Switch that I would use to play most of my games online with my friends and family. Prior to modding my main Switch, I never had an SD card in there because I always just bought physical games. And likewise, my OLED Switch does not contain an SD card because all of the games that I own are physical. And it's not even something that I feel like it's a limitation. It's one less thing that I have to purchase whenever I get a game console. And it's not that I have no digital games, it's not that I don't download anything from the internet either. But since most of the games all come completely on the cartridge, or at least a majority of it on the cartridge, I don't ever have to worry about that memory filling up too much. Now, obviously, there are titles that you're going to buy that aren't going to have the entire game on the cartridge, and they're usually third-party titles. This happened on the Switch 1, and yes, this happens on the PlayStation 5 as well as the Xbox Series X. But for the most part, if you're a PlayStation or a Nintendo owner, Xbox is a little bit more hit or miss this time around. If you make a point to being strictly physical, depending on the types of games that you play, you should be able to get away with it without too much of a headache. And by headaches, I mean all of the excessive downloads and having to connect to the internet if you don't want to connect to the internet and whatnot. Now, once again, I'm not sharing my anecdotal experience with you because I think this is how people should live with their titles. And I'm also intentionally not bringing up the ownership aspect of all of this, because I've already discussed that quite a bit, and a lot of people online have discussed that as well. A big reason why I'm trying to share my experience with you, as well as my family's experience with you, is because these are very real experiences of people that try to predominantly purchase physical games. In this very same hypothetical scenario, if I had purchased my nephew's a Nintendo Switch 2 a few years ago instead of a Nintendo Switch, while yes, the first party games, they didn't have to deal with any of these issues, my nephews actually own a lot of Sonic games, some random like Nickelodeon titles and SpongeBob titles and whatnot. If the Switch 1 is when Game Key cards was introduced, that's what they would have had. Which means every few months, whenever I get a chance to visit my sister, I'd be buying them a game, and then I would disappear, right? Like, I don't live next to them. And then they're putting the cartridge in their console, so excited, and then it turns out it doesn't work. So now mom's gotta go and turn on the Switch, and she has to download it for them, and then she's gonna have to buy an SD card to expand the storage. It just feels like all of this extra work that shouldn't have happened in the first place. If all the third-party titles I had purchased for my Nintendo Switch had required additional download space and everything, I would have been spending a bunch of money on SD cards that I did not need to spend. And let me be clear, this is just a minor nuisance. I don't think it's actually that big of a deal. Like, in my opinion, the bigger deal here is the ownership aspect of it. The longevity of these things, that's a bigger deal for me, but I'm trying to avoid having that discussion right now. But even from a practical standpoint, this is a minor nuisance, but it's an easily avoidable nuisance. And it's a big reason why this is so unappealing, because there's been a tried and true method that has worked since, what, the Atari? You grab a cartridge, you slap it onto your console, and it works. Everything is on there and it's ready to go for you. And if you're going to go out of your way to make these cartridges in the first place, why don't you just make sure there's enough memory in there so that you can fit the game in there? And obviously this issue did exist on the Nintendo Switch 1. I remember like when Mega Man Legacy Collection came out, people were complaining because only the first half of it was on the cart and the other half you'd have to download. I think I got that right. Like, the Switch did not have this down perfectly, but the Switch was actually very good and much better than what we're seeing with the Nintendo Switch 2, just based off of the few titles that have come out already. And obviously the big issue here is that Nintendo is going out of their way to make the cartridge. They're making one that's 64 gigabytes, and then the other one is 0 gigabytes. It's just a key card. So you're putting the decision in the third-party developers' hands, forcing them to either lose from their profits because they have to buy the 64 gigabyte card for their 7 gigabyte title, or to round down and go with the obvious cheaper option in hopes that people just accept that game key cards become the norm. And from what we've seen so far, the third parties have actually chosen the alternative that is cheaper, but it was obviously met with a very negative reception. And I'm not just saying the controversy online, I'm saying the sales reflect that it was met with a negative reception. Now, I actually do think there is a scenario here where the game key cards can exist. I don't necessarily think Nintendo needs to do away with them. And obviously the rumors that a lot of people have discussed recently is that Nintendo is potentially adding more different sized cartridges to be able to accommodate for different sized games. So like Puyo Puyo Tetris does not need to be on a 64GB card, but we can fit it onto an 8GB card. That allows Sega to spend a little bit more than they would on the Game Key card, but it's not so much more that it would be pointless. And in addition to these rumors, Nintendo sent out the survey. Now, I actually filled out this survey very early on. I think somebody shared it online, I don't remember where, but I was actually warming up on the treadmill when I saw it, so I filled out the survey while I was walking. And in my mind, I was like, oh, I'm definitely gonna look back at this later and take a bunch of screenshots of it. Turns out it got shut down pretty quick. But despite the picture that I think a lot of people have been trying to paint about this survey, believe it or not, I actually thought it was very positive. There was one issue I had where it gave you a list of like 6 or 7 things to pick about why you would buy a physical title versus not. And I think I checked them all. I was like, yeah, these are all great reasons to buy a physical title. But then it's like you can only pick 3 of them. So I find myself in a dilemma where I have to decide between whether resale value or ownership is better for me. And I don't know how Nintendo will spin that based off of the results. So I thought that was problematic. I also didn't like how in the survey Nintendo doesn't specifically mention the game key cards. Don't get me wrong, they completely describe it, and if you're somebody that's been following along and you're going through the survey, ideally you'd know exactly what they were talking about. But I still feel like it's a very dirty play on their end to not just be like, guys, listen, will you guys buy this game if it's a game key card? Yes or no? And then everybody just clicks no. So it's very clear they're not buying it because it's a game key card. And clearly they're looking to deliver some data so they can make some charts and share it with their shareholders and be like, see, they don't really care about this. It's only about this that matters. But either way, I thought this was a very positive survey, especially for that abomination of a survey that they sent out to the Japanese players a few weeks ago. And I think it's positive for a couple of reasons. Number one, for the reasons I discussed earlier about the drawbacks of not having a full game on the cartridge. Number two, because I like to have games completely on a cart so that in 10, 15 years from now, I don't gotta worry about connecting the thing online. I could just buy a cartridge, put it in the game, and it's good to go. You know, like in the future, let's say I'm going on a road trip and I tell my kids, yeah, let's stop at Best Buy and just buy a couple games so that we can play for the road. Ideally, I'd like to just be able to buy the game and put it in their Switch and they can just play it. Instead, I'm just gonna put it in their Switch and then all of a sudden it's like, wait, hang on, we gotta pull over and find a place with internet so that we can download this game on every single person's Switch so we can continue. Again, it's a minor nuisance, but it's a nuisance that's completely avoidable. But the other very big reason why I like the fact that Nintendo is reacting to this game key card situation is because people have this idea that Nintendo does not need to adapt and they don't need to listen to their user base. This idea that there is no point in trying to do anything to get Nintendo to change because they're unchangeable. And while that may have been true throughout the lifetime of the Nintendo Switch because of how high they were flying, as we saw when they transitioned from the Wii to the Wii U and from the DS to the 3DS, it's not always guaranteed for them, and they're always stressed about how they're going to pull off the success on the upcoming console. And this is not to say that I think the Switch 2 is a Wii U or a 3DS. Not yet. But even back in May of 2022, Shuntaro Furukawa in an interview said, "The question of whether we will be able to just as smoothly transition from the Nintendo Switch to the next generation of hardware is a major concern for us. Based on our experiences with the Wii, the Nintendo DS, and other hardware, it is very clear that one of the major obstacles is how to easily transition from one hardware to the next." And Nintendo clearly has some concerns with the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2. You don't have to agree with me about how I feel about the sales numbers. You don't have to agree to me that I think that they should be doing better than they are right now and this thing should not be readily available. You can go ahead and drum about the 6 million sold in 7 weeks and celebrate. I don't care about that. But what you can't argue with me is the fact that Nintendo is clearly concerned about the third-party support on the Nintendo Switch 2. And they are aware that the third-party support on the Nintendo Switch 2 is not doing that well. I don't know if you guys remember, but during the time of the Wii U, at the start of it specifically, a lot of third parties came into the picture because they're like, oh, we gotta be on this console if it's gonna be as big as the Wii. They showed up for like a year maximum, and then they all slowly withered away. Now, part of the problem is that they're not actually giving their best games onto the console, and they end up being ports of old hardware, but that's the same situation with the Switch 2. The last thing Nintendo wants right now is for 2K, Madden, FIFA, all of these companies to come in and see a console that's not worth investing their time and effort into, and then just decide to barely support the thing throughout the duration of its life. And it's more important this generation than it was in every generation prior, because in this generation, they're trying to push that this is a stronger piece of hardware that's going to make more money because of third-party support. And I mean specifically the major third-party support, not like the dinky little games that we got on the Switch. Those giant AAA titles that people would have otherwise bought on a different console. So right now, if Madden was to not sell well, and it's strictly because of the game keycard situation, that's a huge problem for Nintendo because they could have succeeded with Madden if they did not have the game keycards, and Nintendo wants to make sure there is no risk like that because it might have been avoided. Now the thing is, the third-party titles that have come for the Nintendo Switch 2 so far are old ports. Like, there's nothing that's new and groundbreaking that's been released yet. So it's legitimately pretty hard to gauge if the third party is not doing well because it's nothing new or because of the game keycards. Obviously, I've made this very clear. I haven't been shy about this. I think Nintendo is a first-party console more than anything else. I've discussed this in depth. I've talked about the differences in the top 10, top 100 games that were on the Switch versus the ones on the PS4, and you see a lot more major AAA third-party titles in the PS4 numbers. And that's not to say that nobody is buying third-party titles for the Switch. I bought third-party titles for the Switch, but it's those first-party titles that bring people into the Nintendo atmosphere. So I actually don't know how well not having game keycards will help, but I imagine it will help it, at least to a notable extent. But in Nintendo's case, this is clearly a problem, and it's a problem they need to address fast. That's what they feel. Because those early sales numbers will set the tone about whether this is a device worth investing their time and effort into, or if it's something they're just gonna put their C-team on. Whatever the case is, I think it'll be very interesting to see exactly how Nintendo responds to all of this. For all we know, they could be doing the survey and then just pretending that they're going to fix something and then nothing changes. We just stick with game keycards for a while. Maybe I'm being naive here and assuming that some kind of pushback is working and Nintendo is concerned about different stuff, and they're hoping to find a solution for that. But I don't know. There are a few things that I've been wishfully optimistic about. Like in the case of the Mario Kart update, I'm like, that's clear. It's very evident that Nintendo is fully aware that Mario Kart World has died down, and that's why they had to update it and try to make it so that there were more 3-lap races in there, even though they completely botched that. But you know, that's part of me is being hopeful that that's actually the case, that they're listening and they're trying to solve something. In this case, however, with the game keycards, I think it's a lot more evident that there is clearly an issue, and the issue is reflected in the sales, and Nintendo is now trying to find a way to solve that problem. And it's not to say that if Nintendo was to solve this problem, all of a sudden everything else is forgiven. I think this is one of the easiest things for them to solve, in my opinion. But if this amounts to the removal of game keycards, or at least the addition of multiple sizes of cartridges, it is hopefully going to be a good lesson to the Nintendo fandom, and maybe even the entirety of the gaming community, that if you are to speak out and you are to push back against these companies and you are to vote with your wallets, eventually they will give people what they desire. And honestly, I'm just so sick of people blindly defending game keycards specifically. Like, I just can't wait for those same people to come out and talk about how great Nintendo is because they did away with the game keycards and they actually listen to their fans. They're still gonna be full of crap at the end of the day, but at least they're not trying to defend something that everybody hates. And they're only doing it because they feel like they have to be the white knight warrior to protect their corporation, and the Nintendo fans out there need something positive to clap about. And I'm not saying that everybody that bought a Nintendo Switch 2 is like that. I think there are some people that are just a lot more level-headed than others. I've been kind of distinguishing the difference between the consumer and the customer recently. The Nintendo customer, the Switch 2 customer, has integrity, has a brain. I'd say the Nintendo consumer, those are the ones that are problematic. I think that's a nice enough word to use to describe them. In any case, I wish to say that I will never be making another game key card video again because I am so sick of talking about these things. But the reality is this is going to be a discussion that most certainly will come up again, and probably in the near future. Anyway, that's all I got for you guys tonight. Thanks again for listening, and I will catch you all on the next one.